When a black man starts repairing his fence, his racist neighbor, Karen, immediately calls the cops, accusing him of trespassing. But what happens next turns the tables in a way no one saw coming. A buried truth from her past emerges, one that changes everything. A simple act of home repair spirals into a shocking revelation when a racist woman calls the police on her neighbor. But as secrets unravel, the man discovers something about her past that no one could have imagined. Was she always this way? Or is there more to her story than meets the eye? Stay till the end. This truth will leave you speechless.
James Parker wiped the sweat from his brow as he hammered another nail into the wooden planks of his fence. It was a hot afternoon in the suburban neighborhood where he had lived for over 5 years. A hardworking black man in his mid-30s, James had built a good life for himself. His home was his pride, and he took care of it with dedication. Across the yard, hidden behind a lace curtain, Karen Williams scowled. She had lived next door to James since he moved in, and from day one she had found reasons to complain. It wasn't just about the noise or the yard. Deep down, she resented the fact that a black man owned a house right next to hers. As James continued his work, Karen narrowed her eyes. Why is he messing with the fence? She thought. Is he up to something shady? Her heart pounded with irritation as she reached for her phone. Within minutes, James heard the unmistakable sound of police sirens. He looked up, confused, just as 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of his house. Officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holsters. "Sir, put down the hammer and step away from the fence," one officer commanded. James raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? I'm working on my own property." Karen emerged from her porch, her arms crossed. "He's been out here for hours, sneaking around the fence. I don't know what he's up to, but I don't feel safe," she announced loudly. James clenched his jaw. "I'm fixing my damn fence, that's all." The officers exchanged glances. One of them, Officer Reynolds, approached Karen. "Ma'am, are you sure he doesn't live here?" Karen scoffed. "I've never seen him here before." James laughed dryly. "I've lived here for years. And she's been my neighbor this whole time." Officer Reynolds sighed. He had seen cases like this before. "Sir, can you provide proof of ownership?" James shook his head in disbelief, but walked inside to grab his documents. Meanwhile, Karen smirked, feeling victorious. But she had no idea this was just the beginning of a confrontation that would expose a dark truth about her past, one that even she wasn't ready to face. James walked back onto his porch, gripping a folder of documents. His hands were steady, but his frustration simmered beneath the surface. He handed the papers to Officer Reynolds, who glanced through them. The deed to the house and utility bills prove that James was exactly who he claimed to be. "Everything checks out," Reynolds said, handing the documents back. He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, it looks like Mr. Parker owns this property." Karen's face twisted in disbelief. "There must be some mistake. I've lived here for 20 years, and I know everyone in this neighborhood. He wasn't here before." James let out a bitter chuckle. "That's because you never bothered to see me as your neighbor, Karen." The second officer, a younger man named Officer Grant, crossed his arms. "Ma'am, did you actually see Mr. Parker doing anything illegal, or did you just assume—" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had called the police countless times about suspicious people before, but they had never questioned her motives. "I was just looking out for the community?" she stammered. James shook his head. "No, you were looking out for yourself, and you assumed the worst because of my skin color." Officer Reynolds sighed. "Ma'am, you should be careful about making false reports. There are real crimes happening, and we can't waste resources responding to unfounded suspicions." Karen's face burned with humiliation, but something inside her refused to back down. "You don't understand," she muttered almost to herself. This neighborhood used to be different. James folded his arms. Different? How? She hesitated. Her fingers trembled as she gripped her porch railing. Safer, she finally whispered. The words hung in the air like a foul stench. James felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. He had seen this thinking before. Safer for who, Karen? He asked quietly. Karen didn't answer, but the look in her eyes said everything. Officer Grant sighed. All right, if there's no crime here, we're leaving. Mr. Parker, sorry for the trouble. James nodded. Just doing your job. But as the officers turned to leave, James noticed something. Karen's hands were shaking. Her usually sharp gaze flickered with something unfamiliar. Fear, regret, and then she did something unexpected. She whispered, barely loud enough for James to hear, I have my reasons. James frowned. There was something in her voice, something more profound than just racism, something personal. He didn't know it yet, but Karen hid a past she had spent decades trying to erase, and the truth was about to come out. James stood still for a moment, watching Karen's face. Her hands trembled, and her lips pressed together as if holding back words. Something about her reaction didn't sit right with him. You have your reasons, he echoed. What does that mean? Karen took a step back onto her porch, her jaw tight. It means you wouldn't understand, she said, her voice cold but unsteady. James narrowed his eyes. Try me. For a brief moment, it looked like Karen was about to speak, but just as quickly she shook her head and turned away. Just leave it alone. But James wasn't the type to leave things alone, significantly when something didn't add up. That night, James sat on his porch, staring at Karen's house across the street. He had lived in this neighborhood for 5 years, and not once had she ever acknowledged him, except to glare, complain, or, in this case, call the cops. But something about today felt different. Karen wasn't just a racist older woman stuck in her ways. There was something deeper, something she was hiding. James pulled out his phone and started searching online. If she had lived in this neighborhood for decades, there had to be something in the public records. After a few minutes of digging, he found something, a tragic news article from the 1980s. Local family mysteriously disappears. Mother and daughter nowhere to be found. James frowned, reading further. The article described a black mother and her biracial daughter who had vanished from the area, leaving behind an empty house and unanswered questions. The woman's husband, a white man, had reported them missing, but the case had gone cold. He scrolled down to a grainy black and white photo of the mother and daughter. The mother's name was Teresa Mitchell. James stared at the picture, his breath catching in his throat. The little girl in the photo. She had Karen's eyes. His heart pounded. Was Karen the missing child from this decades-old case? Had she buried a part of her past to fit into a world that wouldn't accept her truth? James closed his laptop, his mind racing. Karen wasn't just a woman who hated seeing a black man in her neighborhood. She had once been a black child in this neighborhood, and she had spent her entire life trying to erase that fact. James had uncovered something far more shocking than just racism. He had uncovered a buried identity, and now he had to find out the truth. James barely slept that night. The discovery about Karen had shaken him. How could she be the same little girl from that missing persons case? And if she was, why did she hate people like him? By morning, James had made up his mind. He had to confront her. He walked across the street and knocked on Karen's door. At first, there was silence. Then the door creaked open just a little, revealing Karen's wary eyes. "What do you want?" she snapped. James took a deep breath. "I know who you are." Karen's face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" James held up his phone, showing her the old article. "Teresa Mitchell. That was your mother, wasn't it?" Karen's breath hitched, and James saw something other than anger in her eyes for the first time. Fear. She opened the door, grabbed his arm, and pulled him inside. "Are you crazy?" she hissed, slamming the door shut behind them. "Where did you get that?" James watched her closely. "It's public record. You can't erase the past, Karen." Karen turned away, her hands shaking. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me," James said gently. "Tell me what happened." Karen stayed silent for a long moment, staring out the window like she was looking at something far away. Then she sighed and sank into a chair. "My real name isn't Karen," she finally said. "It's Olivia." James felt his heart pound. "My mother, Teresa, she was a black woman married to a white man in a time when people didn't accept it. My father's family, his entire world turned against them, and one day she just vanished. Took me with her." James frowned. "Vanished?" Karen, Olivia, nodded, her face tight with pain. "She said we were going to start over, that we couldn't stay in this town anymore. But she never made it out." James felt a chill crawl down his spine. "What do you mean?" Karen swallowed hard. "One night, she left to get food. I waited for her. Hours passed. She never came back." James clenched his fists. "And no one looked for her?" Karen laughed bitterly. "Oh, they looked. But they didn't care. My father's family took me in, changed my name, made me one of them. I was young, confused, and terrified. I did what they told me. I learned to act like them, think like them, and forget who I was." James felt his chest tighten. Karen had spent her entire life denying her black identity, and now here she was, calling the cops on him, a black man, for simply existing in her space. "You let them turn you into the same kind of person who would have hated your mother," James said, his voice full of disbelief. Karen flinched, but she didn't deny it. She just whispered, "I know." Silence filled the room. For the first time, James saw not a racist older woman, but a broken person, haunted by her past. And maybe it wasn't too late for her to face the truth. Karen, Olivia, sat silently, her fingers trembling as she traced invisible patterns on the wooden table. James could see the weight of her past pressing down on her, years of self-denial unraveling before his eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered again, but this time her voice had no anger, just exhaustion. James pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Then help me understand." Karen exhaled slowly, as if gathering the strength to speak a truth she had buried for decades. "I was only 6 when my mother disappeared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "One moment, she was tucking me in, telling me everything would be okay. The next, she was gone." James leaned in, listening carefully. "My father's family took me in," Karen continued, her hands clenching into fists. "They told me my mother abandoned me, that she never really wanted me, that she ran away because she couldn't handle being a mother." James felt his stomach twist. It was a lie. It had to be. "But deep down," Karen said, her voice breaking, "I knew it wasn't true." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away as if she had trained herself never to show weakness. James let the silence stretch between them before finally asking, "What happened to her, Karen?" Karen swallowed hard. "I don't know." James narrowed his eyes. "Or you don't want to know?" Karen stiffened. "I searched for her when I got older, looked through police reports, missing persons files, but there was nothing. It was like she just vanished off the face of the earth." James clenched his jaw. A black woman disappearing without a trace in a town full of people who resented her? He didn't believe that she had just run away. "She didn't leave you," Karen said firmly. "Something happened to her." Karen nodded, her lips pressed together as she fought back emotions. "I know." For years, she had buried her pain beneath anger, hatred, and fear, turning into the very thing she once feared the most. But you still called the cops on me, James pointed out. Karen closed her eyes. Because that's what I was raised to do. The room fell into a heavy silence. James exhaled, running a hand down his face. And now what? You gonna keep pretending to be someone you're not? Karen's hands shook on the table. She looked down, her breath uneven. I don't know who I am anymore. James stood up. Then maybe it's time you find out. Karen looked up at him, her face pale, her eyes filled with something that looked like regret. James turned to leave, but Karen spoke again before he reached the door. There's one place I haven't looked, she whispered. James stopped. Where? Karen hesitated, then met his gaze. Their basement. James's breath caught. Her father's family's basement, where secrets were buried, where the truth had been hidden for decades. And suddenly, James realized the real story was beginning. James stared at Karen, his pulse quickening. Her family's basement? The words hung in the air, thick with implication. You think she's down there? James asked, his voice low. Karen swallowed hard. I don't know, she admitted. I never had the courage to look. But I remember strange things, whispers at night. My grandfather locking the basement door like it held something more than just old furniture. My father warning me never to go down there. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had lived long enough in this town to know that some things were never spoken about because they were too terrible to face. Karen's hands trembled as she stood up. I need to go back, she said almost to herself. James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. This was madness. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, and not getting involved in the ugly truths of this town. And yet, looking at Karen, Olivia, he knew she couldn't do this alone. I'm coming with you, he said. Karen's head snapped up. Why? James met her gaze. Because if we find what I think we're going to find, you're going to need someone who's not afraid to call the cops on the right people. Karen hesitated. Then, for the first time, she nodded. That night, they drove to her childhood home. The house was a relic of the past, sitting on a dying patch of land. As they approached, the porch creaked under their weight. Karen's hands clenched around the spare key she still had. I haven't been back here in years, she murmured. James glanced at her. No one lives here? She shook her head. My grandfather died. My father moved away. The house was left to rot. James exhaled. Then let's get this over with. Karen unlocked the door. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of dust, mold, and something else that made James's stomach turn. They silently moved through the house until they reached the old wooden basement door. Karen reached for the knob, but hesitated. Her breath was uneven. James put a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to do this alone. She nodded and turned the knob. The door groaned open. A wave of cold air rushed out. James flicked on his flashlight. The wooden stairs creaked as they descended into the darkness. Karen gripped his arm. Then they saw it. A rusted metal lockbox, half buried under old crates and dust-covered sheets. Karen's breath hitched. That wasn't there before? James knelt, brushing off the grime. On the lid, there was an engraving of her mother's name. Karen covered her mouth, her body trembling. James pulled at the latch, but it wouldn't budge. Stand back, he said. He grabbed a rusted crowbar lying nearby and jammed it under the lid, forcing it open with a heavy creak. Inside, neatly stacked, were old papers, police reports, missing person flyers, and a bundle of letters. Karen snatched them up, her fingers shaking. She read the first line out loud. To my dearest Olivia, if you ever find this, it means they never let me leave. Karen gasped. James clenched his jaw. Her mother hadn't abandoned her. She had been kept here. And suddenly, the house felt suffocating. Karen looked at James, her eyes wide with terror. I think I know what happened to her. Karen's hands shook as she clutched the letter, her pulse pounding in her ears. They never let me leave. The words were seared into her mind. James took the letter from her trembling fingers and scanned the rest. His expression darkened with each passing second. I tried to run, but they always found me. Your father, your grandfather. They told me you would never know the truth, that no one would believe me. But if you're reading this, Olivia, it means there's still hope. Karen let out a shaky breath. They locked her here? James looked at the rusted lockbox, the police reports beneath it, and the fading ink on missing person flyers, her mother's face staring back. It looks like she tried to escape, James said, his voice thick. But they covered it up. Karen clutched her stomach, nausea rising in her throat. Her mother had never abandoned her. She had been a prisoner, a victim of the same men who raised her. James rifled through the papers, his expression turning grave. Karen. He pulled out another folded sheet, an autopsy report. Karen's breath caught. No. James hesitated, then read it aloud. Cause of death? Blunt force trauma. Official ruling. Accidental fall. Karen stumbled back, hitting the basement wall. They killed her. A sob tore from her throat. All these years, I hated her, thought she left me, thought I wasn't good enough for her to stay. James placed a firm hand on her shoulder. This wasn't your fault. Karen wiped her eyes. They got away with it. Not anymore. She looked up at James, his jaw set in determination. What do you mean? James grabbed his phone. We're calling the cops. Karen tensed. Who's going to believe us? My grandfather was well connected. My father... James met her gaze. They don't own this town anymore. He dialed. A beat of silence passed before a voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? Karen exhaled shakily. I want to report a murder. Days later, the town was in shock. News broke about the decades-old crime hidden in Karen's childhood home. Investigators dug through the basement, uncovering bones, records, and undeniable proof of her mother's tragic fate. Karen sat on her porch, watching reporters hound the police chief. Her father had been arrested. Her grandfather's legacy was shattered. James sat beside her. You did the right thing. Karen wiped her tears. I spent my whole life hating the wrong person. James nodded. Now the world knows the truth. She turned to him. And I have you to thank for that. James chuckled. Not bad for a guy who was just fixing a fence, huh? Karen smiled, genuine for the first time in years, for the first time she was free. Enjoyed this story? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales. Let's spread the message of hope and unity together. Thanks, and take care.